Welcome everyone. Hello and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name's Professor Simon Gilbody. I'm an epidemiologist and a behavioural scientist, which, I don't know, means I'm a doctor who can count, I think. And so it's my great pleasure to be here, to be chairing this evening's event, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you here today. So on the trip over here to campus, I was compiling a little list in my mind, and it was a list of media celebrities who also happen to be medically qualified. So it's an illustrious list. So down here, I've written Dr. Sir Jonathan Miller. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, happy to be here.
You're happy to be there. So, yeah, neurologist who also was a theatre and opera director and a public academic. So we like Jonathan Miller. Dr. Lord Robert Winston. Yeah. Very eminent. And Dr. Professor Alice Roberts. And I can't get to the end of this list without mentioning Dr. Harry Hill. So,
yeah.
And in that theme, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Deborah Cohen. So Deborah's an award-winning broadcaster. She's a journalist and she's also been an editor who's worked across mainstream and academic print. She's worked in digital, in TV and in radio. She's been the science editor for ITV News. I'm sure she wants to tell us a bit more about her time during while she was working in ITV. She's also been the health correspondent for BBC Newsnight, and she was known to many during the COVID pandemic when there was lots of coverage around COVID and lots of people.
That's quite a bit, yeah.
Yeah, maybe we'll come on to that. And for me, it was interesting. She was also the person who established the investigations unit at the BMJ. So for those who don't know, the British Medical Journal is one of the foremost medical journals in the world, you know. So as an academic, it was always my greatest aspiration to get papers into Deborah's journal. And one of the things I knew about Deborah from way back is that she used to write the nicest rejection letters of anyone I ever worked with. So
First
it
time
felt
anyone's
as though
ever said that to me, I think.
it felt as though she was genuinely disappointed to not accept my manuscript. So, and it left me feeling sorry for her when she had to reject the manuscripts we sent in. But anyway, I've said a bit about Deborah. So I'm going to ask some questions of Deborah over about 20-30 minutes. Then we're going to open it up to a conversation with the audience. And I guess my first question is still a back question, really. So I've said a bit about you, but who are you and where you come from?
There we go. Well, funny you mentioned Scylla. I'm from Liverpool.
No way.
And that's where the book started off, or one of the ideas for the book started off. But thank you for that introduction. It's really nice to be here. Just as a quick stock take, who has turned to the internet or social media for health information? No judgment. Yeah. I have. I use ChatGPT. I just used ChatGPT earlier today for my sins. So just everyone turns there, and this is what this book's about. But it started off, I was in Liverpool, and as you said, I worked on ITV News, and I was health correspondent of Newsnight during the pandemic, and that was brutal reporting. It really was some of the, I say that about every story, it was the toughest reporting I've ever done. Writing the book was the toughest thing I've ever done. But it was really, really hard every day when huge uncertainty, people wanted certainty, massively polarised debate. Any given day, I was either a COVID denier or I was part of a global conspiracy putting 5G in vaccines. You know, you're talking about that and reporting against that backdrop is pretty hard. And then I went to ITV News where I was their science editor. And bluntly, I was quite burnt out. And I don't know whether anyone's worked in TV here, but TV News is brutal. So it's much smaller ITV News than the teams at the BBC, but Newsnight's tough because it's a very small team and it's its own team within the BBC. So I work with like Emily Maitlis and Lewis Goodall and Nick Watt, people like that, people you might have heard of. So it's quite a different beast, but carrying that programme for 2 years through COVID was really difficult. I was the only one with any sort of science background, and I happened to have a medical background. So for the editor, it was like manna from heaven. Everyone was like, oh, right place, right time. I was like, nope, wrong place, wrong time. Then going to ITV, you're up at 6 in the morning, and you don't really know where you're going to be at any moment. You know, you can get a phone call, right, get the train to Manchester, then you're not, oh no, we need you to go down to Norfolk. And you're probably not fair if you do a live broadcast the news at 10, you're probably not getting home till about 11:30. Then you have a bottle of wine to try and get to sleep, and then up again at 6. And it's quite an unhealthy lifestyle, because you're not sitting down for lunch, you're not sitting down for tea, you're just constantly on the go. And I burnt out. And then it was when I thought, I'll just freelance again. I'll go, because I used to work on Panorama as well, so I thought I'll just go back to doing documentaries. And you look up, and the media landscape has totally changed. And it's all gone online. And what you've seen is this big convergence between traditional TV, where you've got your big camera crews. Now all you need is a smartphone. And then traditional print have all gone to social media. So you've got this big convergence online, where everyone's producing content for social media and digital media. And someone said to me, do you want to be an influencer? And I was like, no, I couldn't think of anything worse. Absolutely not. But I thought, I need to get my head around social media and start looking into it. So this book came about for a couple of reasons. First of all, I was back home in Liverpool, and I was at my auntie's birthday party, and one of my cousin's friends turned to me, I'll do a Scouse accent now, just bought an EMH test online, and that's anti-malarian hormone. And I said, well, why did you do that? And she said, it's going to tell me how fertile I am, isn't it? And I was like, well, is it? And she said, well, that's what they said to me on social media. The influencers said to me, but it doesn't tell you how fertile you are. It's used in IVF to help guide treatment, but it can't give you a black and white answer to tell you how fertile you are. But that's how it's being marketed online. So it sort of occurred to me that this huge marketplace that people are going to find their health information. And then at the same time, I was speaking at a conference in Denmark, at the Royal College of GPs in Denmark. And there's this big movement in medicine called overdiagnosis, preventing overdiagnosis and too much medicine. So the idea that we over-medicalise everyday anxieties and symptoms, and we're increasing the sort of pool of what we consider to be medicine, as opposed to things happen in normal life. Sometimes you feel a bit rubbish and it doesn't necessarily need a diagnostic label or a treatment. But the idea that you expand the criteria for what is considered a disease. And I was talking about screening, and if anyone knows anything about screening, it's one of the hardest things to communicate. It's just a tricky thing to get your head around. And someone was talking about influencers and the things they were selling. And I came away and thought, oh, maybe influencers are making us sick. Maybe they're encouraging us to take medicines and commercialise health when actually we don't necessarily need a treatment or don't necessarily need a diagnostic label. So that was the sort of idea behind the book. And then I pitched an idea and got an agent, pitched an idea, and they accepted the proposal. I thought, oh God, I've got to write the thing now. it's that moment, yay, I've got a book agreement. Oh, what's next? And so that's just a bit about me in a nutshell.
Well, that's pretty good. And, you know, this is a thumping good read. And there was a phrase that jumped out in the first chapter, and it talks about the commodification of health. And it introduces a phrase, and I think you've maybe adapted a phrase that was used by Dwight Eisenhower. So he used to talk about the military-industrial complex. So you talk about the wellness-industrial complex. So tell us what you mean about that, Deborah.
So the idea that we sort of have typically thought, well, you go and see a doctor when you've got symptoms, when you're feeling unwell, and the idea is you were sort of healthy until you're proven sick, until something happens. And it's all sort of flipped on its head, and the idea that we're sick until proven healthy, there's always potentially something lying underneath. And it's a very clear marketing tool. Create fear, create anxiety, and then sell something against it. So what's happened over the last, 10 years perhaps, maybe slightly longer, is we've got more apps. We've got all this health tech. We've got lots of supplements. We've got this boom of online pharmacies and online services that are all marketing stuff to us. We've got this disease expansion, if you like. The drug industry has expanded what we consider well and unwell, from illness to health, and they've expanded those markers. And we're constantly told, be well, be well. Just think about how many celebrities there are promoting supplements or promoting, particularly in women's health around menopause, promoting HRT, promoting apps that track your symptoms or books, and the idea that you can hack your health really easily. So we've got this whole market, and actually the wellness industry is worth more than the drug industry. It's worth trillions. And, you know, whether that's from yoga and some very sensible things, right through to sort of interventions or things that are not going to make a difference, or there's an absence of evidence whether it's going to make a difference. So it's got this massive industry around it, and it's sort of all squeaky and seems quite squeaky clean and everything else, but actually it's a huge industry, and it's got its own playbook. So we think in healthcare of the commercial determinants of health. So what the commercial determinants of health are all these industries that shape our healthcare or shape our health. So classic example is the tobacco industry. For years, tobacco industry knew that smoking caused cancer, but suppressed information. They lobbied governments to not put sort of restrictions on smoking or increase taxation. They changed the science, they paid off scientists to do the studies for them, and subverted, if you like, the medical literature. And that's a playbook that we've seen throughout healthcare. It's the same with the alcohol industry, food industry, the pharmaceutical industry. I wouldn't put the drug industry in the same basket, but we know that they select the studies that they want to study. We know that they select the statistics, the population they want to test on. We know that they publish favourable results over negative ones. I mean, there's legislation that's supposed to prevent that, but it doesn't. We know they lobby governments around drug prices. So there are tactics around it. And I came to this idea as well with social media and this new commercial, so big tech, if you like, and all these new players in healthcare. That was a new commercial determinant of health. And it could be called the wellness industrial complex. And it's a mashup of health tech and wearables and online pharmacies and the drug industry, all marketing to us and persuading us that we need a treatment when perhaps we don't. So that's where it's sort of come from.
That's so interesting. And so I think what you're describing to us there is the commodification of health, which is something we hadn't seen before, perhaps not to this extent. And it sounds as though it also bypasses many of the checks and balances that exist. For example, we don't have direct-to-consumer advertising in this country. So maybe help us understand how they've managed to subvert the normal checks and balances that exist that help protect our health, the commodification of health.
So actually you mentioned, so in other than the United States, who's been to the US here, United States? Have you all turned on the telly where you've got those adverts where there's drug adverts and this is the drug that you need to have, and then you get a long list of side effects. So that's direct to consumer advertising of prescription drugs. Other than the United States and New Zealand, there's a ban on that direct-to-consumer advertising. So you can't advertise it, except, I've got a piece coming out in the BMJ about this in the next couple of weeks. Social media allows people to subvert because it's very hard to regulate. If you think TV is quite easy to regulate, TV in this country is regulated by Ofcom. So as a broadcaster, radio, TV, you're regulated by Ofcom. YouTube isn't regulated by Ofcom. Podcasts are outside the Ofcom code, and our newspapers are regulated by IPSO. But there's not that many of them, and you're meant to get, so it's easy for the regulators to keep an eye on what's there. The problem with social media is it's huge, and everybody's algorithms are slightly different. So from a regulatory perspective, it's very hard to know what's going on. And so with the direct-to-consumer advertising ban of prescription drugs, it's happening. It's not necessarily happening drug companies in this country, but we're getting it all from the United States. And the geo-fencing that's supposed to happen doesn't happen. I've just got myself into a tangle with Meta, sort of asking them, because one of the Kardashians, I think it was Chloe, was advertising a prescription-only migraine drug, and it was in my feed. I was thinking, that isn't supposed to be targeted at me. But it's very hard. And then they use online pharmacies or influencers. So there's all ways to get around that ban. And I go into it in a little bit of detail in the book, but I go into more detail in a piece I've got coming out in the BMJ. So there's that. So prescription drugs is banned. But the rest of health, there isn't the same ban. And the Advertising Standards Authority is supposed to moderate claims and check claims, but they can't. And it was actually Baroness Coates, who is the chairwoman of the Advertising Standards Authority, said, it's about 2024 this was, that we've imported American-style advertising into this country with prescription drugs, but also all these other things like pharmacies and clinics and health techs and medical devices and diagnostic tests. They don't have the same regulatory oversight. In fact, they don't have the same regulatory oversight, full stop. So as you know, to get a pharmaceutical prescription drug onto the market, you have to do phase 1, 2, 3 trials. So you have to do a big clinical trials before you get marketing authorization or approval, as it's sometimes known as. You don't necessarily have the same evidentiary requirements for other parts of healthcare. The other trick, but what the MHRA, so the MHRA is our regulator, so they regulate drugs and devices and diagnostic tests. What they are is they're interested in devices. Obviously they're interested in drugs, but devices that are aimed at sick people, so people with health conditions, medical devices. What they're not interested in is things that are targeted well people. So who's heard of a continuous glucose monitor? So what these do is they continually track people's glucose, and they're licensed, they're recommended, and there's good evidence for people that have type 1 or type 2 diabetes who use insulin. It's not necessarily the other diabetes drugs, but there's good evidence there. And they're regulated by oversight from the MHRA. But there's a much bigger market in people who are well. So what now you've got a lot of the companies is pivoting towards well people. But the regulators aren't interested in well people. So a part of this wellness industrial complex and part of the issue is social media. If you have the companies pivoting from their products from ill people or people with medical need to people who are well. And social media is a brilliant platform for advertising because of the lack of oversight. And again, in the back of my mind when I was writing it, I thought, this is what happens when you put health on platforms that are geared for shopping, because we know the algorithms really sort of prioritise that, and also entertainment. What can possibly go wrong with those two combined? One thing if you're going to buy a lippy or a handbag or a pair of trainers or something like that. It's another thing entirely if you're thinking about your health, you know, and the kind of oversight you might need and the claims that you might need. And it's a minefield for people I blame nobody for going online to look for health information. You know, in fact, you want people to be empowered. But finding your way through that is an absolute mess. And I did some work recently for Ipsos, the polling company, about trust. And people were sort of saying, we've never had so much access to information, but never been more confused or know what to believe, because there's such a plethora of information out there. And a lot of it is commercially incentivized. Now, even, who knows about how the algorithms work? Algorithms are a real black box. So algorithms are what sits behind your social media feed or your YouTube feed or any of these feeds. And what they do is they pick up on when you might hover over a post, or obviously if you like it or you retweet it, say, for example, or you put it into your feed, or you send it to somebody else. The algorithms are constantly monitoring this. We're leaving tiny little breadcrumbs about our behaviours all over the place. And what the algorithms do is then feed you more and more and more of that stuff. So let's say you hover over something about ADHD. You get more and more and more of the same ADHD stuff coming up in your feed. And so what we know as well is they also prioritise extreme sentiment. So it's either this pill's brilliant for me or this pill was an absolute disaster. So if you think about the weight loss drugs, it's this, I lost loads and loads of weight with this drug, or this gave me a Zempic face or a Zempic bum or whatever else. It's really polarised. And if you think about why you go onto the feed, you tend to go onto the feed as well. You tend to post when something has happened. If you took something, nothing much happened, it wasn't very eventful, how likely you're about to feed. So people are making sort of decisions in this space where it's very heavily commercialised, it's polarised, and it's very difficult for people to sort of really know what's going on and what's unpicking and unpacking what's behind some of what they're seeing. So there's some of the challenges.
We've seen how this polarisation plays out in terms of public discourse and where we've ended up politically. But I guess what follows on from what you've just said are influences and our algorithms making us sick.
And that, I would argue, I think it's changing. I think there's an absence of, I'm sitting on the fence here, aren't I? In the book, I didn't come up with really, really strong conclusions because I think one of the worst things, if you're unpicking bad science, I don't want to go and commit bad science myself.
Yeah.
So I was quite cautious, and at times we've just got an absence of evidence. It's understudied. And one of the problems for people like you, Simon, is that, and this is what Michael Marmot said to me, is that if you're Mars or a company, you can go out and do market research really quickly. If you're an academic, you have to go and get funding, then ethical approval, then go and find someone to publish it who'll probably reject it, very politely in an email. and so academia is just always that bit further behind the curve. So the companies are sort of stealing a march. So are they making us sick? I think, and my hunch, and again, I wouldn't want to overstate it, is that I do think social media is having an impact on our expectations of healthcare, what healthcare can do and can't do. And one thing sort of really became apparent to me is that, you know, if people don't feel seen by the health service, don't feel heard, don't feel validated, there's people online that can do that. And that's an important thing to know. I think we have to ask ourselves why people are going there and what they're getting from it as a health profession, because there are things perhaps we can learn. So if they're being seen and heard online, but then they're not being heard by the health service, there's this sort of weird thing that's happening, is they're getting the validation, and yet I believe you, I validate you, I hear what you're saying, I felt something similar, and this is the influences, and we can talk about parasocial relationships in a minute, and then they're being sold something, a quick fix. So you see that a lot in the HRT space, hormone or menopause, hormone therapies it's now called, where that's perimenopause, that's when a whole spectrum of symptoms. The quick fix is a hormone. Let's have a hormone. The problem healthcare's got is, you know, if you're a GP, you've got 10 minutes, so you haven't got the time necessarily to validate, and sometimes you're having to unpick. And this isn't to, you know, there's a lot to be critical about health communication by doctors at times, but if you first, some of it, you're trying to unpick and unpack expectations, and this is what repeatedly people were telling me, that, you know, the information they'd seen online, you haven't got as much time in a session to really validate and do the holistic medicine you might want. And at the end of it, you're not giving a quick fix. The answers are often uncertain and complex. So on the one hand, you've got influencers that are sort of saying you, I'm listening, I'm validating you, hearing you, here's a quick fix. And then on the other hand, traditional medicine, squished into 10 minutes, I probably haven't done a very good communications job, and it's really complicated and I haven't got a simple solution. You know, and you can see why people gravitate in a certain direction when that's what they're being sold and being told. And that's before we've even got to the large language models that have a whole new way of communicating, and it's empathic and empathetic and makes people feel listened to and heard. And you're on tap 24/7. You've got access to ChatGPT, whatever time you want, or Copilot or Claude, or whichever bot you decide to use. So there are issues that are sort of bubbling along here that I don't think we've really reconciled with, both on an individual level or on a population level.
Lots going on there, lots to talk about, large language models. But you dropped a phrase in there which was super interesting, and it was a new phrase that I'd learned, and that was parasocial relations. So tell me what you mean. Tell the audience what you mean by parasocial relations. Maybe give us a couple of examples, Deborah.
So, you know, when you see a traditional ad, you might see a celebrity. You might see, I don't know, one of the England players. Oh God, who's sponsoring England these days? Is it Nike or Adidas or Umbro? I can't remember. I'm a Liverpool fan anyway, so I'm much more club over country. But anyway, there we go, classic Scouser. But you'll see a celebrity that might be endorsing Nike or Adidas or a tennis racket or something like that. And you've got that, there's that distance. They're a celebrity. You might write to them and you might get a letter back if you're lucky. That's your sort of classic relationship with a celebrity or someone that's influencing or selling something. Social media's sort of changed that. And it's developed what you call parasocial relationships. So who's been on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube and things like that? Have people been on those platforms? So the classic is where you'll see somebody in their kitchen. Or they're sitting behind the car, or they're sitting putting their lipstick on. And so they're bringing you into their space, making you feel like you've got some sort of connection. You understand them, you know them. And that sort of creates this different dynamic. And if you think about your phones, they're quite a personal space, aren't they? They might be where you FaceTime your kids or your mum or your grandkids or your grandma or something like that. So it's on your phone. And if you think about how TikTok or Instagram look, it fills up the whole face of your phone. So they're right in your personal space. And then you can see that they might have the kids running around or the cat walking across the camera. So you feel like you're in an intimate space where adverts traditionally have been glossy, they've been corporate, they're really obvious, celebrities are there, but they feel distant. The new way of marketing stuff is it feels very familiar. Now, how they foster that, increase that parasocial relationship is if you comment underneath, they'll pick up on your comment or they might respond to you. And that increases the idea that you've got a relationship with these people. But obviously they're only showing you what they want you to see. And there's a new word that I learned the other day, was trans-parasocial relationship. And this is where they drop into your DMs. And that is marketing gold for companies. If they can get an influencer to interact one-to-one with someone that follows them, it really builds that relationship up further. And you can imagine for a regulator, that's a black box. You don't know what's going on in those interactions. So that's the new way of marketing stuff. And they can be quite, they've responded to me. A number of times I've had a friend say, Davina McCall responded to me. And I'm like, anyway. But that's one of the ways of building up. And doctors online are doing similar. And I heard one comment from one doctor influencer, and I thought, I wonder what the GMC would have, the General Medical Council, the doctors regulator, have to say about this. He said, at some point in time, all doctors will have parasocial relationships with their patients. I was like, not sure how that goes down. But actually, doctors are copying that playbook themselves and developing those relationships. And what makes me feel a bit uncomfortable is when they sort of build these relationships, these parasocial relationships with people, but then they lean into authority bias. So I'm just like you, I've got these problems. There's something called the hero's journey, which is what wellness influencers use. I had this condition, I ate this food, or I took this treatment, and it made me better. And look, this is how I cured myself. And you've seen doctors stepping into it, doing the same. So I'm like you, I have my own journey, developing these parasocial relationships, but then leading into authority bias, then saying, well, actually, I'm a doctor, and this is what I do, and this is what I tell you you should do. I feel that's a bit exploitative.
Yeah.
Because it's not dispassionate, is it?
It's not, and we can come on to perhaps some examples if you're willing to
you're gonna
go a little bit further.
I'm a god on legs, I'll say anything, but there we go.
But, I'm looking forward to one of the Kardashians dropping into my DMs, but and I'll try not to be flattered by that. But this is, parasocial relations was the one that you do. Yeah, so that's all interesting. But if we were to think a little bit more about doctors as influencers, it's a double-edged sword, but can you think of any upsides of people with authority or some qualification in the area that they speak of? Can that ever be a force for good, Deborah?
Yeah, I think it can. So I interviewed a few doctor influencers in the book. People have gone online because they thought we've got to sort of get a grip of the misinformation, if you like. And one of them I thought was really interesting, Adam Fox. He's a paediatric allergist. And Annabelle, people heard of Annabelle Carmel, she's the baby book recipe author. And she said to him, she said, you can sit on the morning sofas on TV and you can go to your conferences, but you're not reaching the people you need to reach. Young parents, they're all on Instagram. So he said he grappled with Instagram and had to work out how to do some videos, and his daughter was there helping, probably swearing at him, but helping him try and put some videos together. And what he realised was in clinic, he mightn't have very long in clinic to talk to people about all the different options that are available and things that they might be concerned of. But if he created an Instagram channel, he could do it all there, and he could say to his patients, look, there's loads of videos there. You know me, you trust me, we've built up these relationships. So he's taken up a relationship, a doctor-patient relationship that he's built up in person and put it online. Go online, and you'll see loads of videos there, and if you have any questions, next time, ask me those questions. Make a note of what you want to know, and we can address them. So he directs people to that. And I think what sort of the health of, and I've spoken since to NHS England and NICE and people like that, is I think it's not, they're saying, oh, should we be on these platforms? Should we be on the platforms? I think it's less about being on the platforms because you're fighting the algorithm. Now, Adam Fox is fighting the algorithm, but he's got a way around it because he's interested in his patient group, and it's a way of giving them information. It's more how the information is presented. So if you go onto the NHS website, it's quite dry, isn't it? I like my facts served cold. I'm just one of those people, but not everyone does. So I think what we need to think about is how people are used to consuming their information, what that information looks like, and how you impart evidence-based information in a way that people have become used to consuming. And that, I think, is what we need to think about going forward. And there are people online that are very good at doing that. Healthcare professionals of different stripes, but they are competing against the algorithm, and the algorithm does tend to prioritise polarised sensationalist information. The other thing as well that does really well, and this sort of slightly jars with, if you like, evidence-based medicine, is storytelling. And that was one of the best things I learned at ITV News, is how to tell stories. You've got 2 minutes to take something that's quite complicated and tell a story around it. And on ITV, if it didn't have a person in it, it wasn't getting on air. So even if I was doing something on space, and I know nothing about space, I'd go to an observatory and watch them showing, images from the James Webb Telescope, because just that human interaction with the images sort of brings it to life. And it's people that bring social media to life. And I think we need to work out how to give evidence-based information in a way that's just a bit more human and a bit more real.
Yeah, that's so interesting. But I'm going to challenge you to something that you spoke of a little bit earlier, and that's speaking about screening. It's one of the most difficult conversations that we have in medicine. And there's a phrase I'm going to dig up that might be familiar to you, but might not be familiar to everyone in the audience. So Dr. Muir-Gray. So Muir-Gray, he's one of the bastions of evidence-based medicine. He's one of the, they gave it legs and made it an idea. And he spoke about screening a few years ago. He said that all screening programs do harm.
Yep.
And he said that some do good as well. And the challenge for society and for us as doctors and for policymakers is to work out those screening programs where there's more good than harm goes on. And there's been quite a lot in the media just recently around screening for prostate cancer. But one of the things that you speak about in the book is the notion of whole body scans, whole body screening. So work through the Muir-Gray logic. Tell me a little bit about how this plays out in the internet and in terms of raising people's health anxiety versus all sorts of things.
This is what you call being thrown under the bus, isn't it? I should know by now. So full body MRI. So you go in and you have a full scan of your body to see what's going on beneath. Sounds like it might make sense, doesn't it?
Where do I sign up?
Where do you sign up?
Yeah.
Sounds, well, who wouldn't want to know what's going on inside? But there are problems with that. Earlier is better. The earlier you pick something up, the better. Seems to make sense. It's all sort of condensed to quick memes, isn't it? Earlier is better, prevention is cure, all this sort of stuff. Find out what's going on inside you. But there's a flip side of that. If you're constantly worried about what's going inside of you, you're sick until you're proven healthy, and that's the title of the chapter. Now, one of the problems with screening is, first of all, you've got the issues of false positives and false negatives. Have people heard of false positives and false negatives? So you pick something up that is meaningless. And this is a term, isn't there, in medicine, they call it an incidentaloma. So you pick something up and it's actually just an incidental finding. It's a false positive. But to find out it's an incidental finding, you've probably got to have lots of other tests. And no test, and this is I think what people sometimes find difficult to get their head around, I certainly did, is that we sort of get that drugs have benefits and they have harms. If you take a prescription drug, you accept, don't you? But actually so do tests, whether they're for diagnosis, and diagnosis is you've got symptoms and you're following up what those symptoms are. Screening is where you take somebody that's otherwise well and you try and find out what's going on inside. And there's some fancy statistics around the difference between them, which I won't go into. I do touch on slightly in the book, and I don't get too nerdy, but it's a lot to do with statistics, positive predictive value, negative predictive value and stuff. But I touch on that in the book, so I'm not going to talk about it because I'm going to get it wrong. I need the book in front of me. So that's the first thing. So, and if these new full body MRIs that are being promoted by the Kardashians, they come up in the book quite a lot, and by other people, Pronuvo's one company, and that started off in America, and there's clinics now in London, of course there is. And then there's another one called Neko Health, and Daniel Ek, has everyone heard of Spotify? Daniel Ek set up Spotify, and his big mission now is to prevent ill health. And he's launched a whole series of, these aren't MRIs, but these are he's got his own proprietary full body checks. So they're supposed to go and find things. But first of all, you've got the risk of false positives. And the risk of false positive is it can lead to what's called a clinical cascade. So you have more and more tests and interventions that come with risks and huge anxiety that comes with that until you find out that you've got the all clear or everything's okay. Then you've got the false negatives, so you get a clean bill of health, but actually it's not picked up something that's going on. So you might ignore those nagging symptoms and think, well, I've had a full body screen, I'm fine. I'm not going to go and see a doctor and get these symptoms checked out. So that's the other risk. The other risk, and it's complicated, it's called overdiagnosis. So that is when you pick something up, and it is something, but it's not actually going to harm you. It's not actually going to kill you or lead to ill health. And you end up getting more and more and more invasive treatments to treat that thing that's not going to harm you in the first place. And that's really hard to get your head around. And you can't really see it on an individual level. You have to look at population level to pick up overdiagnosis. So one example, again, I talk about it in the book, is in South Korea. They introduced screening for thyroid cancer. And sounded like a great idea. People took it up in their droves and they got the screening. Oh, I've got something maybe going on with my thyroid. So they had thyroidectomies, the thyroid taken out. If you have your thyroid taken out, you need hormones to replace it. So people ended up having thyroid. And it's not minor surgery having your thyroid taken out. It's got complications, all surgery does. And then you're having all these hormones, lifelong hormones. And what they'd introduced screening, but they noticed death rates from thyroid cancer wasn't changing. It hadn't shifted. So the impact of screening had been nothing. But yet you had all these people with their thyroids removed and loads of hormones for the rest of their lives, and it hadn't made a tiny bit of difference. And that's what we call overdiagnosis. So you can live with some conditions and they're not going to harm you. Or you'll die before it gets to that point. And that's one of the really difficult things when you're weighing up. That's what Mule Gray was talking about. It all does harm, because if you do get something picked up, obviously you're going to have treatment and that can benefit you. But also even breast cancer screening has overdiagnosis. And it's all kinds of screening has some kind of overdiagnosis. And what they try and do is reduce that as much as they can, because it's not very nice for the individual, and it also has a big impact on the NHS as well, because it requires all the extra tests and services and radiologist time, doctors' time, all nurses, all the clinicians around it. And so that's one of the tricks that's one of the things with overdiagnosis, and I'll go into a bit more detail. But the problem is, fear sells. If you think you're walking around with cancer or an aneurysm or something like that, go and get your full body screening, because that's going to pick it up. And that's a lot of marketing in health relies on fear. And they market fear, hype up, you're broken, you might be broken, and here's the protocol to fix it. And that's your sort of standard marketing.
So we've got the wellness industrial complex, feeding health anxiety, that's sending people back into the NHS that's skint already and overworked, and we're not sure that this is doing any good, an ounce of good for anyone. In fact, it might actually be making them ill.
Well, there's not one single medical body around the world that recommends full body MRI for screening purposes. And that includes the American College of Radiology, who stand to make quite a lot of money from that.
Even they have shied away from recommending full body scans.
That's how cautious you should be. But it's not stopping all the marketing. And you can understand, I think, that's quite complicated, but you can understand how difficult that is then to explain on social media. It's far easier to say earlier is better, see what's going on inside, than it is that wordy mess that I've just imparted.
And we see discount codes being dropped into people's DMs. Go and get a body scan without thinking that through. So we're coming to the last question now. You've done a brilliant job of explaining screening, the upsides and the downsides. You've done really well there. So I've taken a few notes. I'm going to borrow that when people ask me that. So I don't know. Everyone in the audience is going to be subject to the wellness industrial complex. And hopefully we'll get a few questions from the audience in a moment. But before you leave us, we're going to go to the internet and to social media to get information, but how can we equip ourselves to be better consumers of information? So this is my last question, Deborah. So what questions should we ask ourselves to help us navigate this world of bad influence? So, some top tips for the audience.
Be a sceptical. But anyway, no, I think one of the first questions I ask as a journalist, and that's what really struck me, is my mates who were largely navigating this space or having to do what I did as my day job. So, why is this person telling me this in the first place? Why is this person deciding to share this information in the first place? If someone comes to me with a story, my first thing is, what do you want? What's your end game? What are you trying... Companies don't bother sending me press releases because they know I'm like, this is fun time. But if I get a press release or someone tells me something, the first question I want to know is, what does this person want? Why are they asking me? Why are they telling me this? And I don't mean that in a really sceptical way, though I am a journalist, so my job is to ask difficult questions. But if someone's online, why they might genuinely, and I sound, let's be honest about social media, it's provide great communities for people and supportive communities. And Liz O'Riordan, who's a breast surgeon, who's had breast cancer herself, when she was going through her chemo, she had a whole community of support on social media that gave her tips when she had nausea or sickness through the chemo or sent her blankets. So there's great support networks out there, and I've been quite sceptical and negative. But then I am an investigative journalist, so, part that one. But that's the first thing. People might be genuinely well-meaning while they're online and really want to help and impart information, feel like they're helping somebody. There might also be, you're the psychiatrist, the sort of little dopamine sort of hit of validation and, look, I'm being liked or I'm being, retweeted and all that kind of thing. We're all guilty about that. I'm certainly guilty of that. Then the other thing is some of the posts are monetized. So the more viral you become, you get more money. And that's had an impact in ADHD, I think, where people I've interviewed tweet their symptoms according to what's going viral. If you think about you then get your information about ADHD from social media, it might be quite different, the social media presentation to, let's say, the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that you use in psychiatry, or the ICD-10, or 11, whichever one's being used at the moment, which is how you diagnose conditions. So it might be quite different. So if you look at conditions through social media, you might be getting a very different perception. So think about what's motivating this person. Then, bluntly, are they trying to sell me something? And may or may not surprise you, but when surveys have been done, less than half of influencers declare their conflicts of interest or their commercial interests. And even then, it can be buried as #ad at the bottom of the post. So are they trying to sell me something? Are they going viral? What is it behind? So first of all, who is this person in front of me giving me this information, and why are they here, and why are they telling me what they're telling me? So a bit of skepticism there. If they're only telling me the benefits of something, what are the harms? Because everything, even diagnostic tests, as we've said, have harms, because diagnosis itself isn't a benign event, but false positives and false negatives. How accurate is this test? What are they telling me about that? If they're telling you a personal story, think, well, that isn't the way medical evidence works. Like in medicine, we've got what we call a hierarchy of evidence. So it's a pyramid. I won't go into details now, but again, it's in the book. Anecdotes and personal stories are the bottom. They're important, but they shouldn't be the sole basis for a decision. There's an evidence base around it. So bear in mind there's an evidence. Then, if they're advocating something, are there alternatives to what they're advocating? The Academy of the Royal Medical Colleges has an acronym they call BRAN. So benefits for treatment, risks or harms. What are the alternatives? And what happens if I do nothing? So they're the things you sort of can bear in mind. And are there alternative sources of information? This has made me interested, but are there more authoritative sources that are accessible that can give me more information? That's loosely how I would sort of... And obviously there are questions, you know, make a note of them and make an appointment if you can. Then that is one of the reasons people go online. You know, ask your health professional about it.
Great questions, great ideas to empower us as we go forward and engage with the wellness industrial complex. But there are loads of topics we've not touched on. We could have spoken about the rise of Ozempic, the rising diagnosis of ADHD, Zoe apps, and the professor who sells those. So lots to talk about there. But I've had the best job in the room by asking Deborah some of these questions, but I wanted to give the audience some opportunities to either ask some questions yourselves of Deborah whilst you've got her here, or to maybe give some reflections on the really interesting Q&A that we've just had now. So over to you, people in the audience. So we've got a question there. So off you go.
Thank you. I wonder how you feel all of this might be particularly influencing young people. We're obviously seeing more diagnosis of things like ADHD, and I've seen a lot of the videos that present really normal human feelings as a symptom rather than just the diversity of what people are like. And I wonder how many young people think, I can't do a normal job, or I can't achieve a certain thing because the internet has told me I have a disability, which they probably don't have, and even if they did have, maybe that wouldn't be the right response to it.
Gosh, you'll get me into trouble now. We know, well, there's reviews going on at the moment into ADHD and into autism at the moment. So, yeah, it's a really good question. In terms of actual numbers, it's very hard to prove, and this is one of the challenges of studying social media, is that was the thing that you saw that changed the behaviour, because we're getting so much information around us from our friends, from our peers, from our families. Social media is just one of those inputs into our decision making on how we behave. And I think what social media does, I think it's sort of synergistic, if you like. It reflects culture back at itself, but also it amplifies it and speeds it up. So one person I quote who's a specialist in, and so has written books on TikTok and everything else, is sort of, he says, what social media does, so for example, the commodification of health, it turbocharges it, it amplifies it, and makes it more extreme. But I think it becomes then synergistic. What was interesting is on the sort of disability of neurodiversity front, I guess, is there was a study that was done in Canada, and it took a group of students. Some had a formal ADHD diagnosis, some had self-diagnosed, and others didn't have a diagnosis or didn't think they had ADHD. And they showed them the top 10 trending, it's either 10 or 100, I think it was 10, ADHD videos on TikTok. And there wasn't a single health professional in there. And think in the top 100, there wasn't a single health professional. It was all personal stories. And they showed them those videos. And after watching the videos, people with the formal diagnosis of ADHD didn't change their minds. That, they knew they had a formal diagnosis. People who had self-diagnosed really became convinced they really did have ADHD. And even those who didn't have it thought that they might have it. And it was only when a psychiatrist came in to explain what had happened, the people that knew they didn't have it was sort of reassured. But those people who'd self-diagnosed totally did not want to hear from the psychiatrist. And I've interviewed psychiatrists in the book, and he said it becomes a real challenge for a psychiatrist to sort of say, well, actually, there might be other reasons for your symptoms. You might have anxiety, depression, to sort of say to somebody that's really, really sure that they have a diagnosis, perhaps you don't, and what does that do to trust? And now there's a whole cluster of sort of private sector ADHD clinics that I think the bar is fairly, and similar for autism, I have been reliably told recently, is that it is far easier to get that diagnosis, to such the extent where certain parts of the NHS don't recognise the diagnosis that's come from that sector. So, and then what happens talking about disability is there's a real sort of sense of identity and belonging, and is it a case of, I think one of the questions we're asking, I've done a lot of reporting around gender. I can't believe I've just said that, because I normally don't normally keep that one quiet, is that sometimes people are looking for a sense of belonging. There's a reason why people are sort of community, loneliness, all these other things, I think, or is it a way of expressing distress. It's another way of expressing distress. And I think these are the things that we need to be thinking about. The diagnosis is just one part of it. But why are people, coming up? What's really going on beneath all of this? And what's interesting about the ADHD space as well is that influencers use something called the Barnum effect or the horoscope effect. So has everyone read a horoscope? There's always something in there that's relevant to you. You think, I'm a Sagittarius. They go, oh, that's me. I'm like extrovert and I've got ants in my pants and I'm always legging it about and stuff like that. That's me. I'm a Sagittarius. Clearly, I'm very typical. Well, that's what influencers do as well with ADHD. They'll give a whole swathe of symptoms and it's like, oh, one of those applies to me. Maybe I do have it. And that was what was trending. So that's one of the issues as well, as how things are described. Similar with menopause. A huge, vast array of symptoms. It might be menopause. It might be because, you've got young kids, you've got older parents, you're stressed at work, you've got a rubbish partner, all these other things that are causing, or other undiagnosed health conditions. But when you look at how it's described, it feels like, oh, that's it, it's got to be menopause.
I experience lots of people trying to tell me I've got low testosterone just at the moment. So,
well, that's quite a confession.
Isn't it? So, moving swiftly on. Has anyone got any further questions? Natasha. We've got a question down at the front.
Thank you. That's been so interesting to listen to. And it makes me think about the Zoe app, just because you can't really ignore it. It also makes me think about lots of dietary testing that seems to be very popular at the moment. So everyone's got an intolerance and they've all got allergies. And then you've also got podcasts like Davina, which are actually very influential, I feel. And I guess what I'm thinking about is, your thoughts on how does all of this affect health inequalities and the money that might be there and people getting themselves into situations which they don't need to be in because they're striving for something, because they're thinking based on what they've listened to or read that is true, in inverted commas.
I touched on all this in the book, funnily enough, and Zoe. My mate Tim Spector. The podcast, the people recording this didn't see me sort of click my knuckles. So it's a really good question. It's the inverse care law, isn't it? It contributes to that. So this all comes with a cost. The old snake oil used to come with a brown bottle, dusty brown bottle, peddling salesman. Now the new snake oil, if you like, comes with an app, a shiny interface, and a subscription is one way of putting it. I'm going to get ABC sued. But anyway, but yeah, I mean, it's and you hear the likes of some of these. Fertility is another one in the hormone world, but Zoe is, they're collecting all these data, but a massive selection bias who can afford this stuff. And anecdotally, again, this is one of the problems. There's a lack of robust evidence. Now, Zoe does say it's done a clinical trial, but I unpicked and unpacked it for the BMJ with Margaret McCartney. And there's clinical trials and there's clinical trials, put it that way. And I won't go into the details, I have to explain what Zoe... Does everyone know what Zoe is? You might have seen it, the big shiny yellow apps. So basically, it's this idea that you've got personalised healthcare, which is personalised nutrition, which is great. Everyone wants personalised nutrition. But a company that was set up in part by Professor Tim Spector, you might have seen a lot during the pandemic, Zoe tracking app for COVID symptoms. Or then, actually, this was underway before COVID, developed this Zoe. If you go into Marks and Spencer's, they've got Zoe things, Zoe kefir or this, that, and everything else. And the idea is you can personalise your nutrition. So it consists of a continuous glucose monitor to monitor your glucose. And this is for healthy people, by the way. Then you do a poo and send it off. And that's supposed to test for your microbiome. When your microbiome is all the bacteria that live naturally in your gut. And we still don't really understand the microbiome. What is a healthy... It varies so wildly. And sometimes what is a healthy bacteria, like E. coli, can cause illness. So what is good and bad bacteria is, it's not always clear-cut and it does change. We don't really know the direction of travel with microbiome yet. So does your microbiome respond to illness, or do changes in your microbiome lead to illness? And all these things we're still trying to work out. Anyway, that hasn't stopped Tim Spector and Zoe using this as a way of helping decide what your diet should be. So you've got your continuous glucose monitor, you've got your poo sent off in the post, and they check one or two other things as well. And then they give you an app that tells you what you should eat. And basically they said they've done a clinical trial and compared it to a dietary leaflet. Now there's all sorts of problems with that from a methodological perspective, which I won't go into. But it's one of and what you've heard anecdotally, particularly with people with the glucose monitors, is which tracks your glucose spikes and ups and downs, is what happens if you eat a banana compared to eating a burger? What's going to spike your glucose? It's the banana, which can make people really panic because they think, oh, my glucose should be flat. I shouldn't have these spikes. Well, yeah. The problem is if it stays really high for a long time, your body's under constant what's called homeostatic control. So if it goes up, your response is to bring it down again. But they've been marketed to believe that actually you should be avoiding these spikes entirely. And anecdotally, GPs are saying and dietitians are saying, oh, we're seeing all these patients that come in and they're terrified they've got diabetes, and then we have to do further tests to rule it out. And then, well, what's the impact then on the NHS? So you've got people that can afford, you're talking about social inequality, you've got people that can afford this stuff or the private diagnostic tests, and I've got another anecdote here, that then panic, rightfully, and there's no blame there, go and see the GP, but then those people that perhaps need it more aren't getting access to healthcare. And it's called the inverse care law. It's Julian Tudor-Hard, published in The Lancet, and it's the sort of classic, those that need healthcare most are the least likely to get it, and it's sort of the social inequality angle of health. And again, the same with diagnostic tests. I spoke to one GP, and someone bought a fecal occult blood test, and that's testing for blood in your poo, which is one of the things that you look for with bowel cancer. It came back positive, took it to his GP. It's done privately, and GP was like, well, I don't know what this test is, we don't use it on the NHS. Phoned up the company to get more information, couldn't provide any more information because diagnostic tests aren't that well regulated, but they're being sold. But then we've got a patient with a a positive test. I thought, well, I can't ignore it. So repeated it on the NHS test, which came back negative. So which test do you then believe? Because every test has false positives and false negatives. No test is 100% perfect. Do you repeat it again? Does that quell the anxiety? Does it quell the doctor's anxiety? Does it quell the patient's anxiety? But again, it's taking up more resource. And again, it feeds into the sort of inequality stuff is those people that can afford these tests then don't necessarily pay for the follow-up. The follow-up comes to the NHS that then displaces resource from other people. So it sort of feeds into a bit of a cycle. And in fact, Patrick Chinnery, who's the exec chair of the MRC, Medical Research Council, when I was chatting about my book, he said to me, kept coming back to me saying, what's the impact of this on the NHS? We don't know, is the answer.
So we don't know. And I don't know, we've got to the end of our hour just now. So I started out wondering whether the relationship between the influencer and the influenced was a victimless crime. And I think I'm starting to think there are harms there. And I think we've begun to hear about those just now. And I thought the question about the inverse care law and how this misdirects resources, finite resources, and makes worried people more worried, it makes poor people more poor, are concerns that we've got. So, in my hand, I have a very rare thing. It is a very rare unsigned copy of Dr. Deborah Cohen's book. And I'm going to say that these are also for sale outside. We've got a brilliant independent bookseller who has copies of these available. And Deborah would be happy to sign copies and answer questions afterwards. So whilst I ask Deborah to sign my copy, I wonder if we could put our hands together and thank Deborah for a brilliant